Hey everyone, this is Mr. Davitt here. I know it's been a little bit of time since we last talked and last went over some material, but because AP decided to shorten the content curriculum only up through 1945 this year, I feel that there's somewhat of a void because we're missing essentially 70 plus years of history. And to be honest, some of this is kind of some of my more favorite history, some really interesting stuff that's going on and happening in the Cold War period. And so I thought I'd create these little videos just to kind of go over what happened. So, as always, these are completely optional. And this is a situation where, again, if you're not interested, definitely don't have to partake. But there's a lot of big stuff that happens here that I do want to inform you on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you right from where we left off when I did that kind of post World War II lesson. That was the last major lesson that we did. And I'm going to take you all the way, kind of almost all the way to the present. And so we'll do a couple different lessons. So today's kind of a continuation of the Cold War. I'll go through Truman and Eisenhower, and I'll talk about their domestic policies as well and things outside of the Cold War. But when we talk about Truman and Eisenhower, we're really talking a lot about the Cold War. And then I'll do one on the 60s. I'll do a specific one on the civil rights movement as a whole. I'll do a specific one on Vietnam, the 1970s, the 1980s. I'll go to kind of our current era, and then I'll do a kind of a president's one as well. If you remember, I did one on the presidents up through Truman that were going to be included on the AP test, but there's several more after, and I do want to kind of do the same thing. So, sit back, relax. Hopefully you enjoy this, and we'll get going here. So, if you remember where we left off last time, we kind of jumped right into the post-World War II period, and we talked about kind of probably the biggest political effect of World War II would be the emergence of the two new superpowers in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. And that's different from before because Britain, France traditionally have been our kind of powers at the very least. And now all of a sudden they're in very bad shape as a result of World War II. And what we have is the US and the Soviet Union coming up as the clear superpowers of the world. And during World War II, these two countries were allies, but then they moved to enemies pretty quickly. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but one of the big things that I can always stress here is the fact that really the only reason why the US and the Soviet Union were allies during World War II was more so of convenience, and also especially because they had a common enemy in Hitler and Nazi Germany. However, by 1945, that common enemy is eliminated. Hitler commits suicide, Nazi Germany is dead, and then we go back to them being enemies. And the reasons for the Cold War happening are varied. We have deep-seated ideological reasons, that big conflict between communism and capitalism. We do have the fact that there is competition to be kind of the number one superpower. We do have both trying to exercise their influence, their way of life throughout the world. And so these are all things that contribute. We also have deep-seated misconceptions, deep-seated suspicions between the two sides that make this really, really hard to work itself out. One of the last things I talked to you about was the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift, occurring in the later 1940s, where the Soviet Union attempted to take over all of Berlin. If you remember, we had the split between East and West, and the United States combated this with the Berlin airlift. Berlin will remain separated throughout the entirety of the Cold War, as will Germany. But even with that being the case, this is kind of our last kind of straw for the two sides. Deep-seated tensions, deep-seated problems that are going on. And once this kind of incident happens, it's pretty clear that there's not going to be kind of an easy resolve to this situation, and this will kind of continue on. So let's get a little more specific into policies that the United States will adapt in order to fight against the Soviet Union, in order to fight against communism. And it's really important to realize throughout this that the United States not only incredibly fearful of the Soviet Union, but also incredibly fearful over communism as a whole. And so if you can remember that throughout the Cold War period, that's going to really help you, because it's going to explain a lot of the actions that the United States will take. So right away, basically, the United States is going to be pretty fearful about the Soviet Union pretty clear early on that the Soviet Union was not only looking to exercise power and dominance in their own country, but also in Eastern Europe. I mean, we see that basically immediately when they install the satellite states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, etc. But also, it looked like they wanted to expand their influence elsewhere, into Western Europe, very much, perhaps a possibility, into Asia, into the Middle East area. So the United States really doesn't want that to happen. Also, remember that the United States did have some reason to fear and be suspicious of the Soviet Union. Remember that the Soviet Union really lied basically throughout all the war conferences that went on. And if you remember, the Soviet Union said they were going to have free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. That, of course, never happens. So the United States is suspicious. They obviously did not fix up their human rights records, and people that went against communism, went against Stalin, went against the Communist Party, were killed or sent into exile. So all these things are causing issues, causing problems. So the United States is going to decide basically they need to figure out a better policy for dealing with the Soviet Union and dealing with communism. And what they come up with is a policy known as containment. And this is developed by a guy working for the State Department, George Kennan. And just as the name basically implies, containment is the policy that basically says Soviet Union communism has already expanded into obviously the Soviet Union itself and then into Eastern Europe. So at this point, the goal then is to not let communism spread and also not let the Soviet Union spread basically past where they already had. So that's why I have this map here for you to look at, because this map is showing you basically where they had gone to. They got all of Eastern Europe, they expanded, whatever else. And this policy, adapted by Kennan, but definitely going to be part of Truman's policy and many other presidents, is basically going to say, you know what, it's already happened there. There's nothing really we can do about that, but we really need to make sure that this does not spread further and this does not get bigger than where it already exists. And so that's going to be a huge, huge goal for the United States, and we're going to really see that in action as this kind of continues on. The first place that the United States is really going to be concerned about is going to be West Europe. Okay, West Europe, they're allies, but what you want to realize here is that kind of these countries, especially places like France and Italy, are really going to be mesmerized and very much vulnerable to the promises of communism. You want to remember something, the ideas of communism, land redistribution, equal wealth, those type of things, those only really become popular when economic times are bad. And in Western Europe, economic times were extremely bad following World War II because of the bombing, because of the destruction that had taken place. And so the United States really needed to watch out and really, really concerned that the Soviet Union had the potential to kind of take over all of Europe and install a communist satellite government. So that's going to be our kind of first focus here when we talk about the Cold War and kind of various Cold War theaters. Want to show you some pictures here of West Europe following World War II, and you can see here the destruction brought about here. This means economic issues, this means economic problems, and again, I really do want to stress this because it helps explain why communism had the potential to become incredibly strong in these regions. And again, Communist Party membership in these countries, France, Italy especially, did soar following the post-World War II period because people were looking for an answer, and in many cases they saw it in the kind of allure of communist ideology. See some more here, and again, we see the death, we see the destruction, and again, these are kids here, but you can see just how much their life uprooted and negatively affected. And again, we're talking about really all aspects here, and so even though we did have the defeat of the Axis powers and we did have the defeat of Nazi Germany, these pictures show us just how much damage was done and just how serious this kind of needed to be resolved. So let's talk about what the United States is going to do in order to try to make sure that communism does not become a reality in Western Europe. And so this really starts with what is known as the Truman Doctrine in 1947. Truman came before Congress, made a speech, And basically, in this speech, he very strongly requested financial support for both Greece and Turkey. Greece going through a attempted revolution where basically communist nationalists were trying to take control. Truman concerned that if they were successful, obviously they would install a communist government in Greece, and also concerned Turkey, being their next door neighbor, that this was going to be problematic as well. And so this is going to basically push to $400 million. And again, quite a little bit of money in 1947, but Congress will approve this measure in order to help the Greek government be able to fight the protesters, the rebels, the revolutionaries that were trying to install communism. And by the way, successful. Greece and Turkey, neither will fall to communism. This is going to kind of adapt to another thing, which is that, hey, look, this is a good idea, but it's limited to only 2 countries. So what should we do in order to try to help these other places? And maybe these other places in Europe, they're not going through communist revolution right now, but they could be. And again, because of the economic problems, because of the issues brought about by the war, this is what makes communism tempting and enticing and all the rest of those things. And so Truman will kind of expand his Truman Doctrine to the Marshall Plan, named after General George Marshall, will kind of be the overseer of this plan. And this plan is going to seek for the United States to aid millions and actually into billions of dollars to kind of all the European countries to help them who were suffering from hunger and suffering from the other economic issues brought about from war. And again, congressional approval will be a little more tricky this time because of the fact that it will be so much money, billions and billions of dollars. However, they will eventually approve once it becomes increasingly clear that this is what's going to be necessary. And the result is actually going to be really, really successful. Huge economic recovery pumped into the region. And really what we have is basically what some have referred to as an economic miracle, as West Europe in a short amount of time will be able to match what they were doing pre-war and even exceed it relatively quickly. And again, there's other factors coming into play, but it's important to realize Marshall Plan money and Marshall Plan aid will go a long, long way into actually making this a reality. And the result will be that communism will not become the reality in West Europe, and these places that were kind of becoming enticed by communism are all of a sudden not going to be anymore. So that area, which was kind of the U.S.'s number one concern, is going to be kind of safe, at least for the time being. So that's going to be really important to kind of pay attention to. We see Truman here, the headline from the Truman Doctrine, $400 million, $300 million, by the way, of that going to Greece, the other $100 million going to Turkey. Some congressional battle a little bit, but nothing too crazy. It will be mostly the Marshall Plan that will be a little bit harder to get passage, but it will end up getting passage. See here kind of Truman Doctrine, and even though that's the focus here, Marshall Plan also being a part of this, and it's pretty simple here. In order to fight communism, in order to contain it, you give these places money. And so that will be, at least initially, the United States' response to this throughout the Cold War period. This, by the way, is the stamp for the Marshall Plan, and it's really interesting to see this. And, by the way, some of Marshall Plan stuff is actually direct aid, direct money, but a lot of it will come in the source of food and other supplies. And so when these boxes of supplies, boxes of food come to Europe, there's going to be this big stamp on there. And in many senses, that's kind of a way to remind the recipients in Europe that it's the United States that is helping them out through all this. And here, by the way, we see the amount of money allocated out throughout the Marshall Plan and the places it went to. And we can see here really all of Western Europe included here, but the United Kingdom and France getting the most. But again, relatively good allocation all throughout. Actually, initially, the United States does offer this aid to the Soviet Union, but of course the Soviet Union will not accept And they'll try to do kind of their own thing with them and Eastern Europe, a different kind of economic assistance plan. It will not be nearly as successful, but of course the Soviet Union would never accept money from the United States at this point in the Cold War. What's interesting also about the Cold War is that it's a war with no hot action, but always remember about the Cold War that the potential for action is always going to be kind of there. So the United States will do many things in order to be prepared for a war that may never occur. Also, even though the United States will never directly fight the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, they do fight in Korea, they do fight in Vietnam, and other stuff like that. So there are smaller kind of sub-wars that do go on throughout the Cold War period, and we'll get into Korea today, and then we'll get into Vietnam another time. So let's talk about what are some of the things the United States is going to do to really expand their military complex. Well, number one is they're going to actually create, for the first time, a Department of Defense within the federal government led by a Secretary of Defense. So that's pretty interesting that this is what's going to happen here. And again, it's the first of its point, but this is established in 1947 through the National Security Act. The United States is also going to create a National Security Council. This is meant basically to acquire knowledge and other things like that in order to protect U.S. national security, NSC for short. And then the other thing that we'll see is the United States will create the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. The FBI had been around since the earlier part of the 1900s, but the CIA more specifically dealing with foreign intelligence and that kind of area. So more so in that regard. And again, because the United States is going to be kind of committed to fighting communism around the globe, it explains why they're going to feel it necessary to create the CIA. We're also going to see the United States resurrect a draft in 1948. Kind of interesting considering that not going to be in the actual wartime. But kind of this idea, don't know if war is going to happen, need to have a draft around so that, ready to fight if necessary. The other thing that the United States will do is we'll create NATO in 1949 with countries from West Europe. NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization that actually still exists today. If you listen to President Trump, he sometimes criticizes NATO currently because he feels like it doesn't necessarily promote U.S. goals currently, but, another story. But in the Cold War, this is very, very important. And this is a lasting, permanent alliance between the United States and allies in West Europe. Really interesting because this is kind of the first time that the United States will involve themselves in a permanent entangling alliance during peacetime. And just a sign that the isolationism that had really dominated the United States up to World War II kind of going away. And the United States now not only involving themselves in world affairs, they're being a leader in there. And the fact that they'll be kind of the main power in NATO really, really shows that. So I think that's really, really powerful and really, really interesting. SEAL, by the way, Department of Defense here. SEAL for the CIA. And this, by the way, is a NATO map, North Atlantic, because of the fact that we have the United States and the Western European countries on the other side connected by the North Atlantic. And then you can see here some of the countries that have jumped in since 1949. Greece, Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1955, and then even some countries that have joined in since. So interesting things going on there, including, by the way, many of the previous satellite states of the Soviet Union. It's extremely interesting because when the Cold War first started, by far the major theater, the major area was West Europe. But as things kind of happen, the United States will be forced to kind of shift their attention and shift their focus to other parts of the globe. And the first major place that is going to be, and really a place throughout the Cold War period, is going to be Asia. So right now I want to talk about some things and some developments that are going to occur that help explain why this shift happened. Number one, what happened to Japan? Well, actually, very interesting. Japan will basically go under U.S. occupation and U.S. recovery from Douglas MacArthur. And if you remember, Douglas MacArthur was the U.S. commander down in the Pacific. It was his island hopping campaign that largely stopped the continued kind of acceleration of Japan into the Pacific, able to be successful there. And he will become the kind of commander of Japan and will lead their recovery. What's interesting is that the Japanese people, when this happens, largely accept MacArthur. They largely accept U.S. rule, realizing that it's just better for their recovery. And because of that, in a relatively short amount of time, Japan will experience great democratization. Japan will actually become a leading democracy, and they'll also have huge economic success. And that might almost seem strange, especially the democracy part, after the years of what we saw in the 1930s especially, and in the 1940s. But this shows kind of this idea that the militarism and the vast militarization of Japan that had occurred throughout the 1930s and 1940s was more of a result of other issues and other problems, and Japan was looking to kind of put that in the back seat and move on. And so they will absolutely reach success, and they will become strong U.S. allies. So that's very much a big success story when we talk about the Cold War in Asia for the United States, is the fact that the U.S. and Japan will remain strong allies, and the United States will be guiding Japan throughout this period of democratization and economic recovery. Here's what's not going to be as nearly as successful in the United States. Beginning in the early 1900s, 1910s really, China had overthrown their government, and in replace there was a civil war going on between two sides, the communists and the nationalists. And the United States kind of semi-supported the nationalists, but nationalist leader was a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, not incredibly popular, pretty corrupt guy, and so the United States kind of stopped supporting him. After World War II happened, the Chinese Civil War went into kind of its last stage, and the victorious side will be the communist side, led by a guy by the name of Mao Zedong, and he will achieve victory in 1949, thus turning China into a communist country. And what's really important to realize about this is that when this occurs, this is a big shift in the Cold War, because essentially overnight, a huge amount of the total world population, at this point China's population, 500 million, give or take, will become communist. And so that's obviously incredibly concerning, to lose China to communism. And by the way, this will start a period of about 20 plus years where U.S.-Chinese relations will be incredibly poor, poor trade relations, basically a lack of diplomatic relations, all really, really bad stuff. The other thing that happens within the same month, actually, in 1949, is that the Soviet Union will develop their own atomic bomb. And this happened much to the surprise of the United States. The United States obviously expected them to be able to develop it at some point, but did not expect it to happen as early as 1949. And so now, all of a sudden, the U.S.'s fear of Soviet Union, the U.S.'s fear of communism will grow even stronger and worrisome. And that's going to cause some of the things to happen that will take place in this early Cold War period. So I've kind of alluded to some of this stuff, but how is the Cold War going to affect society in the United States? How is it going to affect everyday people and all the rest of these things? And the reality is, it is going to in quite a few different ways. So first off, U.S. paranoia, and I really use that word paranoia because that's a lot of what this is. A lot of this is going to be kind of an irrational fear that the United States is going to have, this fear that communism was going to take over the United States. Again, that's not really going to be rooted in reality. Communism membership, formal membership, never was very strong at all in the United States. So that's not going to be a problem. But also fears that communism was infiltrating the U.S. government, going to dictate foreign policy and cause the United States to make bad foreign policy decisions. So in order to try to combat that, it will actually be the federal government that institutes a loyalty program. And this is where federal government employees were investigated in order to ensure loyalty. And these were loyalty tests, basically. And due to some of their answers, some of them will be even forced to resign, be dismissed. Very serious stuff. Many states will employ loyalty oaths. A lot of these are going to be actually for teachers. And the idea here that it was really important that teachers and other people of authority did not share positive viewpoints about communism. It was important that they shed light on the dangers of the Soviet Union, the dangers of communism, those type of things as well. So you can imagine kind of how preposterous this seems, but in the context of the early Cold War, U.S.'s fear of Soviet Union, U.S.'s fear of communism is going to be so strong that it's going to really push them to institute some of these measures. A specific committee within the House of Representatives, the HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, will become permanent in the post-World War II period. And this is where basically they're going to go after people that are suspected communists. And the same kind of thing. If you're somebody that's suspected of being communist, even if not rooted in reality, you have the potential to be seriously blacklisted and basically never be hired in your field from that point on. In some cases, even deportations, and just overall reputations ruined. The fact that if you were somebody that was seen as being a communist, you could basically never repair your reputation and never be able to be successful here. So really, really tough stuff. Truman, by the way, will be reelected in 1948, a close election, but nonetheless, he will be reelected back into the thing. And something that you want to realize is that for a lot of this kind of Cold War society, there's going to be a lot of attacks on Truman as not being basically tough enough on communism. So that kind of shows you the overarching viewpoint of Americans, which was that communism was terrible. Communism was a real fear that needed to be watched out for, and that everything that people could do in order to minimize that was part of their responsibility. And that's what you kind of see here in this post. Help the HUAC, help root out commies. Same thing here, the Red Menace. This is a film, by the way, and again, this shows red, remember, always associated with communism, just how kind of serious this threat was. So it's kind of against this context and against this backdrop, we get into our first kind of major Cold War conflict, which is what's going to happen in Korea. So I'll just kind of give you the backstory of this briefly. If you remember, Korea was actually occupied by Japan, and then obviously Japan surrendered, gave up Korea, and after the wartime, Korea was split along the 38th parallel. The south side of Korea, South Korea, was allied with the United States, and so they tried to kind of create a democratic, capitalist, free market economy. And then the North was allied with the Soviet Union, and the idea here was that, you know, kind of more so communist-leaning, more so allied here with Stalin and Soviet Union and all the rest of these type of things. Both sides will kind of see the recovery of each, and then in 1949, both sides leave, you know, again, still maintaining relations, but kind of saying at this point, okay, you know, figure things out, whatever. Well, in 1950, the north side of Korea will attack the south side of Korea in what most agreed to be a pretty unjustified attack, and they're going to really bombard the South Koreans as the South Koreans get pushed basically all the way back into the southernmost part of their border. And so what we're going to see here is the United States, fearful of the expansion of communism, again, North Korea, allying with the Soviet Union and being more so associated with communism. And they're going to appeal actually to the United Nations and say to the United Nations, hey, look, what we have here is aggressive action from one place to another, and we need to do something about it. So the UN will condemn North Korea and basically tell them to leave. And when they do not, this will lead into formal UN police action, where basically the UN agrees to push military into the southern part of Korea to push the North Koreans back. And what this really turns into, although it's technically going to be UN police action, is this will be primarily US troops that are going to come in to South Korea and try basically to save the day and prevent them from being totally overtaken by the North. Here we see, by the way, the picture of the split right here on the 38th parallel. And when we talk about just how far the North got into the South, you can see here before the U.S. and the UN became involved, this was how far they got. All this red, other than this very, very small part that the South Koreans were holding on to. So you can see the necessity here of the United States kind of jumping in here to save the day. And by the way, these are the two leaders of the Koreas in 1950. On the left side, we see Kim Il-sung, who's going to actually be, he's Kim Jong-un's grandfather, our first leader of North Korea. And then on the opposite side, we have Syngman Rhee, who was the leader of South Korea. Okay, so let me just make some comments about what's going to happen as far as the fighting in Korea is concerned. So it's actually going to be Douglas MacArthur, our World War II Pacific general and our commander in Japan that's going to be on the ground, leading the ground troops. And what's interesting here is Commander-in-Chief is obviously the President, President Truman. His goal is going to be very much in sync with the UN, which is to pursue a limited war. And what he's going to say here is, hey, look, let's just push back the North Koreans past the 38th parallel, secure the border, and then we'll be good to go. Well, the United States will actually be able to do that relatively successfully. And within a few months, they're able to push the North Koreans back up into the north and kind of save South Korea. However, what happens next is not exactly what the original plan was, which is that the war will be escalated into the north. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the United States, especially MacArthur, just felt that there was too much U.S. momentum to stop. And there was also this idea here that maybe not only would the U.S. achieve containment in Korea, but maybe even rollback, where they could actually literally roll back a place that had become communist and push it into the capitalist, democratic, free world through this. So again, kind of a lot at stake here. This will end up being a pretty big mistake for the United States. The initial gains into North Korea will be combated, so it won't be worth too much. And then the other bigger problem that comes into play here is that the Chinese, feeling that the U.S. was pushing too close to their border with North Korea, will actually enter into the war against the United States. And when this happens, this makes it so there's a lot more lives lost. The initial successes from the campaign into North Korea will not be very successful at all. There's also going to be a lot of back and forth going on throughout this war between Truman and MacArthur. And MacArthur is going to be really pushing Truman to get more aggressive, to invade North Korea full assault. MacArthur even going so much as to suggesting using atomic weapons on Korea. Truman will say, no, let's not do that. And when MacArthur criticizes Truman openly, this will actually lead to Truman firing MacArthur. However, MacArthur will come back very much to a hero's welcome. There even will be a little parade for him, and people will feel like Truman was being too easy on communism, was not doing enough here, and that MacArthur was the real hero and had been unfairly let go. Because of the fact that MacArthur will be seen as a hero and Truman kind of seen as the bad guy, this will be a huge reputation ruiner for Truman. The other thing is that many critics will dub Truman's war when talking about North Korea and the Korean War. And the reason why is because, remember, Truman only got clearance from the UN, not the U.S. Congress, in order to go to war. So this is going to cause some interesting kind of controversies, and at least initially in the height of Cold War, in the height of paranoia over communism, this will really ruin Truman's reputation. Here we see U.S. troops crossing the 38th parallel, thus changing kind of the whole dynamic of the war as a whole. And this, by the way, is a look from the Korean War Memorial. By the way, the nickname oftentimes given to the Korean War is the Forgotten War. And it's because a lot of times it's that one war that's kind of forgotten. And I'll get kind of into the results as to why that's the case. But, close to 40,000 American lives lost, a lot more Korean, Chinese lives lost. Really a change in how the United States is going to conduct themselves throughout the Cold War period. So it's really a war that we shouldn't necessarily forget, but it's one that oftentimes is. And a lot of that has to do with another war in Asia that will take kind of the priority, which will be the Vietnam War, which we'll get into a little bit later. And this, by the way, kind of a famous picture of the Korean War. And we just want to remember that even though the war is not being fought in the United States, the U.S.'s presence in Korea will certainly have an impact on the Korean people, and in many ways, a pretty negative one. All right, so it's getting this backdrop and this context that we're going to kind of move ourselves into the rise of our new president serving from 1953 to 1961, Dwight Eisenhower. So by 1952, Korea was still unsettled, largely had kind of come to a stalemate, and there were negotiations going on between South and North Korea, United States, and really hadn't come into much. And so because of that, Truman had become unpopular. And there were a couple other things as well that were kind of seeing him being unpopular. The economy had definitely kind of fallen apart, especially because of the expenses brought on by the war. And also, kind of this overall feeling that Truman wasn't very good and wasn't really that strong against communism. So in 1952, the Republicans are going to put up Dwight Eisenhower for election. If you recall, Dwight Eisenhower was actually the major World War II commander in Europe. He'll be the guy that was helping coordinate D-Day and all that kind of stuff. So definitely popularity as a wartime hero. And what he's going to do is, first off, play on the unpopularity of Truman. And he's not running against Truman. He's running against another Democrat, Adlai Stevenson. But he's going to be able to use the unpopularity of Truman to basically discredit the Democrat Party as a whole. Kind of a cool development. 1952 is the first time we see campaign TV ads go on, and Eisenhower does a pretty good job, or his team does a pretty good job of painting Stevenson negatively and kind of painting himself as being really, really good. And this will lead to Eisenhower victory. And again, a lot of this just has to do with the fact that, Truman was pretty unpopular. So one of the first things he's going to do, and it was really a promise he had made on the campaign trail, is that he's going to end the Korean War. And finally, in 1953, the Korean War will end. Korea will still be split after 3 years of fighting, so it kind of comes into this question of why even bother fighting? Like, why did the United States get themselves involved in this war to begin with? But again, so much of this has to do with the fact that, this fear of communism and Soviet expansion had moved itself into, Asia, and needing to protect that was a huge, huge key point of this whole deal. By the way, here's Eisenhower, and here's his vice president, Richard Nixon. Nixon, by the way, from Southern California, actually grew up in the Whittier area, and will later be president of the United States, but he's going to be Eisenhower's vice president first. And here, by the way, we see the electoral map for the election of 1952. In both the popular vote and the electoral vote, he does pretty well, and he's able to achieve a pretty substantial and solid victory. And here, by the way, this map I really like. It shows the Korean War in 4 images. And so we start with before, in June of 1950. Then we see the Northern attack, and that was how far they had gotten in September. Then the U.S. comes in within a couple months, able to push back beyond the 38th parallel, and then pretty far into North Korea. And then by the time war ends in 1953, South Korea has gained a little, but very, very little. So, again, not really so exceptional. A lot of lives lost, a lot of money spent. I guess technically containment achieved. It's kind of like almost so what. All right, let's talk about a guy that is going to use the paranoia of communism and the Cold War in order to rise to power and then also fall relatively quickly, which is this man here, Joseph McCarthy. So McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, actually originally when elected a pretty poorly rated senator. However, he's going to gain popularity as he goes after people that he's going to claim were communists that had infiltrated into the government. And in particular, he talked about communists that were in the State Department. And this was a very serious charge. But something important to realize here is that even though he didn't have any proof, many Americans bought onto it because they kind of feared this already. So it's like if you fear something and then somebody tells you it exists, you're much more likely to believe it because you already kind of did think it existed. So that's what he's going to kind of do. Everything McCarthy said was basically fabricated on lies, no evidence, no proof into anything, yet was able to use the Cold War atmosphere of fear and paranoia in order to get what he wanted, which was popularity, followers, and things like that. Again, you know, his popularity was strong for a couple years as he went after people, people that worked in government, other types of professions as well. And so much of this has to do with the fact that Americans were so afraid of communism in the early 1950s that they were willing to believe McCarthy, willing to subscribe to what he was saying, and kind of latch on to his major ideas and thoughts. At the end of the day, McCarthy just ended up going too far. He went after some pretty high-end people in government, and the big one is that when he went after the Army, that was really, really a problem. His hearings where he tried to accuse the Army of harboring communists and conducting a communist foreign policy are known as the Army McCarthy hearings. They're actually the first televised hearings in American history, and people glued themselves to the TV in order to see McCarthy and see what he did. The reality is, though, it was largely these hearings and them being televised that showed people that this was not the guy to trust in. He was crazy. He was out of control. He was unfounded in what he said, and it took TV for people to kind of figure that out. As a result, McCarthy was censured, basically silenced in the Senate, and then died a few years later from complications due to alcoholism. But McCarthy's always an interesting person to look after when you're talking about just how far the fear of something can go, in this case, the fear of communism. And actually, in many cases, today even, we use McCarthyism to describe that type of what we'd say like a witch hunt or something like that. Here's kind of one of the more famous McCarthy things. He made a speech, said, "I have in my hand a list of 205 people that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who are nevertheless still working and shaping the policy of the State Department." Again, total lies. He did not have a list of any names. No Communist Party members in the State Department, but able to use this in order to rise up on the fears of the common American people. Here's an image from the Army McCarthy hearings. We see him here just looking confused and not really sure what was going on. And then another one here as well. And you can see some of the people listening to him just kind of dumbfounded as to what even he's going on here. Okay, so it's during Eisenhower's time that we see an end to the Korean War, and we see the fall of Joseph McCarthy. Again, McCarthy more so does that to himself, but There's some big things that happened domestically under Eisenhower that are worth note here. Number one is that Eisenhower will balance the federal budget. Okay, less spending than Truman, still relatively high, but that's going to be kind of a big thing that he wants to do. And again, ending a war always helps with cutting spending. He's also going to institute an immigration policy known as Operation Wetback. This is a roundup of about 1 million Mexican illegal immigrants that are going to be sent back to Mexico. As far as immigration was concerned, there was still the Bracero program going on. That was supposed to be kind of like the legal way for immigrants to come into the United States, and that was a way in which numbers could be more closely monitored. So he's going to put Operation Wetback into place in order to rid of illegal immigrants in the United States. Something else that's really important to realize as far as Eisenhower is that he's going to be our first Republican president since Hoover. And so because of that, there's an idea that maybe he was going to move more so to get rid of maybe New Deal legislation and things like that. And actually, we don't see that at all. Instead, Eisenhower will ensure that some of the more popular New Deal legislation will become a permanent fixture in U.S. society. And so primarily what we're talking about there are things like Social Security, things like unemployment programs, those type of long-term things that, people had grown popular to, people liked, and he's going to try to make that concrete in here as well. It will also be Eisenhower that's largely responsible for a massive construction infrastructure project that will occur in 1956, which will be the Federal Highway Act. And this is going to be a huge program and a huge plan that's going to build tens of thousands of miles of highways, freeways, etc. Throughout the country. And this will be really, really good for the automobile industry, also really good for the construction industry. This will lead to more suburbanization. Again, we already saw that, but now with more highways connecting people, there's going to be more of a decision to move over there. We see here, by the way, that map of the Federal Highway Act, and you can see here all these major freeways that are constructed. And we see here, for example, in California, the 5, the 15 if you're going out to Vegas, the 10, which actually stretches all the way into the southeast part of the country. So a lot of big construction that's able to occur here. Bad for the train industry. People are going to be driving highways now, not so much trains, but most would consider this to be a tremendous success for the United States. Okay, let's talk about foreign policy, Cold War policy for Eisenhower, which is what's going to be called New Look. And the reason why called New Look is because Eisenhower's going to say, we need a new look for foreign policy. So, they come up with this idea of New Look. And what New Look argued was that containment was not enough, and instead the United States should actually try to rid of communism in places where it existed. This kind of goes to something called rollback. Rollback never really becomes anything too concrete. There really a lot of New Look is just containment, but at the very least trying to kind of stress this idea at this point here. Eisenhower definitely advocated for less military spending. He said, hey, look, we need to cut that. Truman had built this huge, deficit through the Korean War and whatever else. But this is going to be somewhat contradictory. It's also going to be somewhat divisive. And the reason why is because even though he will kind of cut back on traditional military spending, things like traditional soldiers, he increases nuclear weapon spending. And it's during Eisenhower's time that we see a huge increase in types of nuclear weapons, amount of nuclear weapons for the United States. And so that's kind of scary because even though there's peace, the United States is going to have the stockpile, basically, of nuclear weapons ready to go at any point of time if necessary. This also goes to another part of the New Look policy, which is what Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, that you see there, will refer to as massive retaliation, which was basically that if the Soviets or China got out of hand, that, there was going to be massive retaliation, and the United States was not afraid to use these weapons at their disposal? Well, this statement, and also the fact that Soviets will be scaling up their nuclear weapons program at this time as well, will lead to something we refer to as mutually assured destruction, MAD. And this is basically the idea that if either side let off a nuclear weapon, it would lead basically to the destruction of the world and the destruction of everyone. So that idea is actually, kind of going to be able to achieve a lot of peace because neither side obviously is going to want to blow themselves up. So it's kind of an interesting thing to look at there as well. And here we see Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, who's largely going to be the crafter of the new look and a lot of the stuff that Eisenhower will do foreign-wise during the Cold War period. And here we see kind of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction, and the idea here that both sides sitting on a large amount of bombs, but neither side really actually wanting to use it, because if one side sets it off, the other side's going to, and then we're going to have basically destruction of the world. So in some ways, that's going to actually help achieve a lot of peace. Okay, so let's talk about a couple Cold War theaters that are going to go on here so we can understand this a little bit better. Well, it's pretty clear because of the Marshall Plan and other things like that, West Europe will be safe. So we saw, obviously, a move to Asia with Korea. We'll see Vietnam a little bit later. But one of the focuses that Eisenhower is going to turn to is going to be Latin America. Latin America probably should have been on the United States' radar before this point. Latin America, long history of inequality, long history of poverty, long history of political instability. It's those kind of conditions that often lend itself to the rise of something like communism. So that's absolutely going to happen. So, for example, in Guatemala, in the early 1950s, there's going to be a guy that comes to power that's going to threaten to take away U.S. land and U.S. businesses in Guatemala, give the land to the Guatemalans, and the U.S. will secretly have the CIA come in and back a coup in order to get rid of that leader, Arbenz, and be able to install a government that was much more friendly to U.S. and U.S. interests. Again, secretive, but after it happens, a lot of suspicions as to what exactly happened, and certainly many will be pointing the finger to the United States. It's now clear that the United States played a huge role in this, but at the time, unclear. Iran, somewhat similar situation will come into play, this time with oil, and there's going to be a guy that comes to power, Mossadegh, that wants to nationalize the Iran oil and take it away, take U.S. and British control out of it, and once again, the U.S. will secretly have the CIA come in and back a coup in order to get rid of Mossadegh and instead install this guy as the leader that you see on the right, who is going to be known as the Shah. And we'll talk about him a little bit later when we get to the later part of the 1970s. Some other instances are going to lend itself to Eisenhower declaring what is known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, which basically said that if needed, the United States would provide assistance to Middle East nations that were combating communism. So once again, another example of this. Here we see Arbenz and of Guatemala, and the United States will move relatively quickly to overthrow him. And then here we see kind of the map of the Eisenhower Doctrine. Okay, let me make a couple comments here about the second term of Eisenhower. Election 1956 happens. It's actually a direct repeat of the 1952 election, Eisenhower versus Stevenson. And once again, a big victory for Eisenhower, still popular among the American people. They still liked him, etc. A couple of things that will happen in Ike's second term besides for what already had happened. He's going to go after some of the gangsters that were eliciting illegal activity, also had made their way into some of the labor unions and were doing some funky stuff. We also see him fight against corruption at the local level as well as the federal level. And then something pretty interesting that it's going to be Ike that will do is he's going to establish NASA. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that in the late 50s, the Soviets are going to launch a satellite known as Sputnik into space, and this is going to be kind of bad for the United States, who doesn't want the Soviet Union to one-up them, and so this is what they do in order to try to advance their science, aerospace, space technology program. The other thing that this kind of leads to is in the kind of later part of the 1950s, this enriched focus on math, science, and foreign language education as far as being able to successfully combat the Cold War. Again, foreign language, Russian being seen as so ideal. As far as the Cold War is going to be concerned, the United States will continue to develop nuclear weapons and missiles throughout Ike's second term. Stalin will die in 1953, meaning that there's going to be a new Soviet leader who is Nikita Khrushchev. You see him here in the image on the left, next to Eisenhower, who's on the right. And what's interesting here is that there was some hope that with Stalin dying, that maybe there would be a little bit of an easing of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so Eisenhower and Khrushchev will even meet in 1959, see some progress, but then they meet again in 1960, and this meeting is pretty bad. It kind of negates any of the progress that was made in 1959, and that will go away as well. And so throughout the later part of the 1950s, we still see a very cold but very tense Cold War period, and we definitely see the arms race in full-fledged form. The last thing I want to talk about is another development in Latin America, which is in regards to Cuba. So, anyways, throughout the Cold War, the United States offered little economic aid to Latin America, and this actually caused a lot of resentment from Latin America. Again, Latin America, an area that had struggled with poverty, inequality, instability, and Latin America is going to be looking at West Europe and the money funneling in there and kind of saying, hey, look, we're your neighbors. How can you not give us a little bit? So we saw the United States combat some of the issues they saw in Latin America with the coup in Guatemala. This leads to anger as well. Vice President Nixon will actually visit Latin America. This is going to be bad, so much so that Nixon will essentially have to come home early as he's attacked in some of the streets because of the angry protesters. Again, they're not just angry with Nixon, they were angry at the United States and kind of their show of superiority that we know had existed really for a long period of time, especially the later part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s. And then what we're going to see is, in Cuba specifically, the rise of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And by 1959, Fidel Castro had overthrown the leader Batista, who had been semi-close with the United States, but a very awful ruler, horrible to the Cuban people, etc. And with Castro coming in, Castro will not only declare Cuba to be communist, but he's also going to be extremely anti-American. And he's going to speak out very publicly about how terrible the United States is, all the injustice, harm that they've done, how bad they've been to Latin America, etc. And so this is going to cause a lot of contention between the two sides. And again, the fact that Castro is a labeled communist. This is going to lead to a situation where the U.S. and Cuba will not have any diplomatic relations, and then we'll also see a trade embargo put into place that's going to stop trade between the U.S. and Cuba, which will really, really severely hurt Cuba because of the fact that Cuba had a lot of sugar. The United States was their number one trading partner, so this really, really affected them negatively. In close, I'll just make a couple comments here about the Ike presidency. Relatively successful president and a relatively popular president as well. Economically, we saw continued wealth and prosperity definitely occurring during Ike's time. The decision, infrastructure-wise, to build up the highways was really, really critical and really, really a good project. As far as Cold War is concerned, very, very cold still. Okay, not a lot of developments going on there, a lot of issues and a lot of problems as far as really excessive arms building with not much resolve. Infrastructure development, again, we'd say is good, again, primarily with the Highway Act. Probably the limit of Ike's presidency, the biggest one would be his limited action on civil rights. And we're going to have a whole lesson on civil rights, so I don't want to get too much into it now, but all we can really say here is that a lot of huge civil rights things happen during Ike's presidency, and Ike's kind of response to them is relatively limited. Okay, if you want to see these two presidents, by the way, where they usually stack up, it's usually very much in the top part of American presidents. You can see here in our first graphic, Eisenhower at number 5, Truman at number 6, and then if you go to this other one, we see here Truman at number 6, Eisenhower number 7. So always right around there that we kind of notice, and so that's impressive. We definitely give them credit, and again, we see that they're pretty popular presidents. And again, a lot of that has to do with the way they conducted the Cold War. Okay, thanks very much. The next lesson will be on the 60s, a few of the things going on there. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope it added to your knowledge, and have a great day.